Battle of Midway ended 6 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was one of, if not the biggest, American military disasters to occur on American grounds. America was forced to react to a superior Japanese Navy and Air Force, and couldn't gain any traction against the Japanese. They were being pushed around with defeats at locations such as the Battle of Java Sea.
The Japanese Navy tried another bold strategy in effort to take over the strategic American naval base on Midway Island. Admiral Yamamoto believed that this attack on Midway would give Japan control of the Pacific and thrash American efforts on the sea. What he didn't know, though, is that the Americans were ready for this attack and provided their own surprise for Yamamoto's Imperial Navy. Midway was a turning point in the Battle of the Pacific, as the immense destruction of Japanese carriers and planes proved impossible to be reproduced quick enough, and the United States was finally able to take a confident, offensive stance against Japan. United States Naval Intelligence realized that there was a constantly used codename, AF, being used by Japanese communications in order to signify some attack that was going to be taking place on American grounds, but they didn't know where precisely that attack would occur. Jasper Holmes, a young officer in the U.S. Navy, came up with the idea to trick the opposition into stating where they would be attacking. Holmes, who was stationed in Midway, told a base commander on Midway radio to Pearl Harbor that there was an emergency water problem on the island. Soon after this signal was made, American intelligence decrypted a Japanese message stating that AF, the codename, had a water problem and that it should be taken into consideration during the raid. This way, the United States gained intelligence beforehand that Japan was secretly on their way to Midway. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese pilots were out bombing the Midway Islands and were unaware that 3 American carriers were ready to strike back on the fleet. When the planes previously attacking Midway returned, they were set to be refueled and rearmed. This left the Japanese ships incredibly vulnerable because of the highly flammable fuels being put into the planes. American torpedo bombers and dive bombers got separated on their way over to the Japanese fleet, leading the torpedo bombers to be the first to the primed anti-aircraft guns that eventually shot down 35 of the 41 planes. When the high-flying dive bombers finally found the Japanese fleet, though, there was no opposition to their attack, as all of the Japanese Zeros were flying much low, trying to fend off torpedo bombers. 5 minutes after the dive bombers located the fleet, 3 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, had been sunk by American bombs and torpedoes. Soon after this, planes from the USS Enterprise managed to sink the 4th and final Japanese carrier at Midway, the Hiryu. 322 Japanese aircraft and over 5,000 sailors were killed, compared to only 147 American aircraft and 500 sailors.
After the end of Midway, the United States Navy would never again be playing on Japanese terms. They would end up controlling the rest of the war in the Pacific. The Navy would not be found on the defensive again. They would be focused on offensive moves and standing tall against what was originally a strong Japanese fleet. The Japanese Air Force was also an incredibly large part of the Imperial fleet, which had dominated the United States in almost every facet of air warfare since Pearl Harbor. With the sinking of the 4 Japanese naval carriers, the Japanese lost hundreds of their best fighter pilots and engineers. The loss of so many well-trained and experienced sailors led to huge problems for the Imperial Japanese Navy, as the country had an inadequate training program, making it hard to replace the experienced soldiers with those of the same caliber. As if losing their naval superiority was not enough, they also managed to lose their air superiority against the Americans. Japanese production of boats and aircraft were also nowhere near the mass production rates which were coming out of American factories. From 1941 to 1944, the United States produced 18 Essex-class carriers, the USS Hornet, for example, and 99 escort carriers, which were much smaller than the Essex carriers. In the same time period, the Japanese only managed to complete 12 carriers in total. It was clear that the Japanese would have trouble rebounding and building more carriers in time to stop the Americans before it was too late. On top of the amazing United States production output, there were already 3 carriers on the American front in the Pacific. They were all available for the United States offensive against Japan, which would start shortly after Midway with the Guadalcanal campaign, beginning after August of 1942.
Without Midway, one can only assume that things would have continued to go gradually downhill for American forces until they were up against a wall in the Pacific. 3 years after Midway, though, it was America who wound up landing the final blow on Japan's homeland, with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945.
Bye.